Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ATBC webinar, Communicating Tropical Biology and Conservation to Broad Audiences. This webinar is part of the 2020 ATBC webinar series, which started in July with a talk on COVID-19. During the month of August, we have been talking about professional skills and opportunities in tropical biology and conservation. We started with career tips. We then talked about writing skills in both grant proposals and scientific papers. And today we'll be talking about science communication. My name is Losin. I'm the Executive Director of the ATBC, the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. I'm also a faculty at the Department of Botany of the University of São Paulo, here in Brazil, where I am based. My co-host in this webinar is Jennifer Bergland.
Hello, everyone. I am Jennifer, and I'm a science journalist, filmmaker, and exhibit developer for the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
As we all know, biodiversity is a crucial component of all ecosystems and is also essential to the well-being of our planet. And even though we are constantly seeing forest destruction and hearing about biodiversity loss, we also need to make sure that inspiring stories about the great science that's being conducted around the world is reaching broad audiences in exciting and accessible ways. Communicating science is not a trivial task, though, especially to those of us who are trained as biologists and who have not received any formal training in science communication. And so for today's webinar, we have invited 3 experts who work at the intersection of science and entertainment to share their trajectories and tell us about some of the strategies and approaches that they use to make science interesting and accessible to people with diverse backgrounds around the world.
Before I introduce you to our first speaker, I'd like to run you through some general logistics. Can everybody see that? Oh, sorry. So first off, microphones and videos are not activated for webinar attendees. And so therefore attendees will only be able to see the speakers and the moderators. So please submit any questions through the Q&A tab. After the presentations, the questions will be read and addressed during a Q&A session. The chat function is only activated for panelists. So if you encounter any technical issues, please email the addresses listed here. So our first speaker today is Sarah Al-Shafi. Sarah is a global change biologist and science communication specialist who collaborates with artists and entertainment industries to use storytelling to engage broad audiences with complex scientific topics. She created a workshop series, Science Through Story, which she now offers online, training scientists and science educators to become effective storytellers. Sarah has also organized a symposium on the topic, and she consults on science storytelling projects for a wide range of clients. Sarah's currently completing her PhD in integrative biology with the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley. In her spare time, she's an avid scuba diver, hiker, and connoisseur of chocolate chip cookies. She enjoys watching old movies with her partner and their cat and crested geckos. Sarah's going to speak to the challenges of communicating about science and offer us some effective strategies for doing so. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction. And thank you again, Jennifer and Lucia, for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. I'm really delighted. And I'm glad to be here with Neil and Rohan as well. And welcome to all of you. So I will share my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing my title slide now. And if there are any issues with the video or with hearing me, just let me know. All right, so as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Sarah Al-Shafi. I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of Integrative Biology in the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley. And I am also the creator of the Science Through Story workshop series. So today I'm going to start our webinar off by talking a little bit about how to make science meaningful. I always like to start my presentations by telling my own story, since we're talking about storytelling. When I was a kid, I loved animals and nature, as I'm sure many of you did when you were young. When I went to university, I got interested in fossils, and I started studying paleontology, the study of life over time. I was really excited to do science, but I was even more excited to share that science with others. I couldn't wait to tell my family about my work. I visit my mom's side of the family in rural Maryland every summer in the United States. Many of them are farmers, and I always love hearing their stories about their lives with their crops and their cows. But that summer, when they asked me what I was doing, whatever came out of my mouth, I could tell that it all sounded like gibberish to them. I'm guessing maybe some of you have been in a similar situation before. So I thought long and hard about this. It really bothered me that I was failing to convey the awesomeness of the science I was doing to my own family. And I realized that it wasn't that my family couldn't understand what I do. They're very smart people. The problem was that I was not explaining my work to them in an understandable way. I wasn't making it relatable for them. So how to fix this? Well, when I thought about how my family members relate to each other, I realized that they share their life experiences through stories. In fact, this is what we all do every day. We tell each other stories. So maybe that would be a better starting point for talking about science. So I realized that I needed to become a better storyteller. So I turned to professional storytellers. I had been a huge fan of Pixar animation studios, especially my whole life. And it just so happened that their studio was close to my university campus. So I reached out to their story artists and I started learning from them. And I started thinking about how to tell stories about my science rather than just throwing facts at people. When I saw my family again the next summer, I told them stories about my work. They were able to follow along, and they indeed thought it was awesome. Ever since then, I've been offering workshops to help other scientists and educators share their work through storytelling. So it comes down to this. We know that communicating science is hard. But we also know that storytelling holds attention. My story that I told you just now was easy to follow because storytelling actually affects our brains. In this study, a speaker told a listener a story. That's the first line of brain scans. They were both hooked up to fMRIs to monitor their brain activity. And their brain activity actually overlapped. That's the areas with orange that you see in that first line of scans here, if you can see my cursor. Then in the second round, they brought in another participant, hooked that person also up to an fMRI, and the person who heard the story in the first round retold that same story to the new person. And they found that whether you were telling the story the first time, hearing the story, retelling the story, or hearing the story retold, the same areas of the brain were lighting up. In effect, they were sort of syncing brainwaves to each other. When I shared my story with you all just a moment ago, I was syncing your brainwaves to mine, in a manner of speaking. In another related study, they had 4 groups of participants, again, all hooked up to fMRIs to monitor their brain activity, and each group of participants was shown a different type of footage. Group 1 was shown some Alfred Hitchcock, Bang, You're Dead, high suspense, strong narrative. Group number 2 was shown a spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by Sergio Leone. Group number 3 was shown some comedy, Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David. Group number 4 was shown footage of people in a park. So it may come as no surprise that the group with the highest degree of intersubject correlation, in other words, the same areas of their brain were lighting up at the same time, were active at the same time, the group watching Alfred Hitchcock had the highest degree of intersubject correlation. They were all wondering the same thing at the same time. What's going to happen next? The people watching the spaghetti western, about 50-50, cueing in at the really dramatic parts, but some minds wandering. The people watching comedy, only about 20%. So paying attention at the punchlines, but more minds wandering. And the people watching footage of pigeons in a park, no overlap at all. So what does that tell us? If you're telling a story, if you're using strong narrative, you are going to be holding people's attention and people will recall it later on. If there's no narrative, it might as well be pigeons in a park. No matter how inherently awesome you think the science is, there has to be some structure to help people follow along. So stories help us pay attention, organize information, and feel emotions. Therefore, we should use storytelling to communicate science. How do we do this? So while I've been doing my dissertation research, I've also been doing science communication work, exploring how to use storytelling to engage broad audiences with science. And I created this workshop series, Science Through Story. I've run over 50 workshops now for over 40 different groups around the world. We've reached over 3,000 participants thus far. And I started this process by, as I mentioned earlier, initially reaching out to professional storytellers who work in film and other artistic disciplines. And some of those artists have even come and done workshops with me that were open to the public. These are some sketch notes by a very talented sketch note artist named Mark Simmons from a workshop that we ran at UC Berkeley campus on visual storytelling for science communication. And I was joined by a couple of my colleagues from Pixar. And these sketch notes, as well as sketch notes from other things I've done, are all available on my website at the bottom there, sarah-alshafi.com. In addition to the workshops, I also ran a symposium called Science Through Narrative, Engaging Broad Audiences. And this symposium took place at a major biology conference a couple years ago here in San Francisco. And we had both scientists and artists speaking on the same platform about how to engage broad audiences through narrative strategies. And we had people from all different kinds of disciplines. In this group photo here, we have director of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. We have science journalists, we have effects artists, we have animators, we have dance choreographers, we have illustrators, we have sketch note artists, we have videographers, physicists, paleontologists, anatomists, all kinds of people speaking on the same platform. So it was really wonderful to bring all these perspectives together. And we actually published a series of papers out of this symposium in the journal Integrative and Comparative Biology. And all of these papers are available online, open access. You can download them for free, and links to all of these papers are available on my website. And there's all kinds of perspectives here: video game developers, data visualization artists, lots of different approaches to storytelling. So if you're interested in this subject, I think you'll find these very helpful. And we wrote them to be accessible to a wide readership. I've used these papers in workshops with high school students, and they got a lot out of it. So it's written for anybody and everybody. So I wanted today to share with you some lessons that I have learned from working with both scientists and artists. And that first lesson is, think about your audience first and always keep them in mind. So when you're starting a project, even when you're starting a scientific study, it's really helpful to start thinking about your audience at that point rather than waiting until the end. The most important question: who is your audience? Who are you trying to reach? And what is the context in which you will be reaching that audience? Especially important to think about when you're trying to communicate the science. Are you having a one-on-one conversation with somebody? Are you addressing people in person? Are you giving a webinar? Are you writing something that people are going to encounter later without you there? What is the context? And it's really important to think about, with who is your audience, what does your audience care about? What is their experience? What is their shared experience? And the more specifically you can think about the target audience you're trying to reach, the better. But even if you're just putting something out there to reach as broad a general audience as possible, you could ask yourself, what are some things that most people care about? Well, in general, most people, no matter who they are or where they come from, care about things like the economy, safety and health, especially relevant now with the global pandemic going on, policy and politics, anything that affects our day-to-day lives, our future, our continued safety and well-being moving forward, proximity. If I can tie whatever I'm saying to the particular audience I'm addressing, if I can tie what I share with you today to tropical biology and conservation, it's going to be a little bit more relevant to your particular experience and interests. And of course, wow, everyone loves a good wow factor that gets their attention. It's also really important to think about, what is your goal? What is your primary goal for that audience? What is the main thing that you want them to take away from your story? It might be a specific piece of information. Your goal might be to inspire people to take a specific action. It might simply be to get them to see that you are a human being and also a scientist, or a human being and also an artist who cares about the same things that they do. So in addition to thinking about your target audience, I find it really helpful to think about a reference audience. Who might be the most difficult person to reach with what you want to say, what you want to share with them? who would be the most difficult person to get on board? And if you can think about how to craft your story to reach that person and resonate with that person, then you're probably going to capture a much wider audience as well. And if you're trying to reach lots of, like, several different types of people, maybe think about a reference audience, a reference person from each of those demographics, and then you can kind of triangulate your story between those reference audiences. And if you can find the common ground between them and also consider how they might react differently to any aspect of your message or your story, then your story is going to be more effective. So another lesson, very important. Scientists and artists have the same challenge: distill complexity. For example, with science, as an alternative to teaching science as a linear step-by-step process, the UC Museum of Paleontology, where I'm based, UCMP for short, UCMP created a framework called Understanding Science, represented by this infographic. UCMP teaches teaches the scientific method by distilling it into 4 iterative steps that feed back into each other. This is a very clear and much more realistic representation of how science actually happens. So they've distilled the scientific process. And when we're conducting scientific studies, the whole time, of course, we are distilling information and distilling complexity as we go. Same thing for storytelling. Storytelling is all about distilling content. I love this quote by Raymond Chandler, a gumshoe detective novelist. "A good story cannot be devised, it has to be distilled." Now, science storytelling is not about making stuff up or injecting narrative into science. Whether you're dealing with fiction or nonfiction, storytelling is a process of taking a large amount of material and distilling from it the most cogent, the most cohesive, the most compelling story possible for a given audience in a given context. What exactly is a story? There are many definitions out there that you might encounter. This is what I have distilled from them. A story is a sequence of causative events, meaning one event leads to the other, that follow one or more characters dealing with obstacles in pursuit of an objective. When talking about science, I find it most helpful to focus on these essential elements. Who is your main character, or who are your main characters? When you're just getting started, it's helpful to focus on one for the time being. Who is your main character? What is that main character's objective? What obstacles are in the way of that objective? What is at stake if that main character does not overcome those obstacles? What are the consequences? What is at risk? What is the inciting incident that catalyzes the story into motion? Usually this is something that presents a new threat or a new opportunity. What actions does the main character take in response to that inciting incident and events along the way? And what are the outcomes of those actions? So for example, if we were to tell a story about a scientific study visualized here as a dramatic arc with rising and falling tension over time, perhaps our story would look something like starting with some exposition about what got us interested in the topic, the existing problem we were trying to address, the background research that we did, and maybe the inciting incident is the new question that we want to investigate with our study. Or maybe it's a new opportunity or a new problem that has arisen, like a new pandemic that just started, for example. Maybe our first rising tension is finding the right study group. Oh, but then we ran into a complication, obstacle number 1. But maybe then we adjust our methods. That's the action we take in response. And maybe that works. And the climax is we get some results, yay. And then the falling action is the implications, understanding the implications of our study, and we arrive at some kind of resolution or broad theme at the end. And if you'd like to delve more into science storytelling and story structure and science story development, I encourage you to check out my open access paper, as well as a free webinar that I have on the topic, both of which are available on my website. So as an example from my work, this is a press release that I wrote as a student journalism intern for the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology a few years ago. Blood, brines, and microbiology beneath Antarctic glaciers. It's about a scientist studying this really awesome seepage coming out of a glacier in Antarctica that actually looks like a waterfall of blood, hence the name Blood Falls. Super cool, right? So here my main character was the scientist, microbial ecologist Jill McCookie. Her objective was to figure out why blood falls is the color of blood, of course. What obstacle was in her way? Well, the falls flow from under a glacier in Antarctica. So very challenging field conditions at stake, wanting to gain new knowledge, get publications, future grants, build her career, etc. The inciting incident: Jill discovered by taking a sample from the base of the glacier that the brine seeping out of it is actually clear. It turns red when it escapes from under the glacier because it contains iron that gets oxidized. Interesting. So now to figure out where that iron is coming from, she needs to get samples from under the glacier, from brine that hasn't yet reached the outside. So what actions did she take? She collaborated with other scientists, used new technologies to be able to drill down and sample the brine underneath the glacier. And what were the outcomes? She discovered that the iron is actually a byproduct of an unusual microbial ecosystem living under the glacier, which could tell us about where we might find life on other planets or moons. Super, super cool. So in this piece, I focused on incorporating the science into the scientist's personal story of discovery. But the way you use these essential story elements will depend on the subject matter and, again, on your intended audience and your goals for that audience. This is another press release that I wrote for the same organization, SICBI, Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology. This one was called The Cuban Cricket Crisis. New study identifies insect as the likely culprit behind alleged sonic attacks on US diplomats in Havana. Very, very interesting story. So in this case, because of the serious political ramifications of the study, the researcher I interviewed and I decided that it would be best to tell the story of this study in the context of the broader impacts, rather than focus on the personal story of the scientist. And this story was picked up by a lot of major news outlets around the world, so we really wanted to focus on just the political ramifications of the science rather than the personal story of the scientist. Now you can distill a story even further. It's really helpful to start by thinking about those essential story elements that I mentioned. Now here's a technique for distilling your science even further into a very, very concise and compelling narrative that can stand alone or introduce a larger story in just a few sentences. This is called the ABT model, which stands for and, but, therefore. As in, for example, there was this and this, but then this new thing happened, therefore this resulted. Or another example, we know this and this, but we don't know this yet. Therefore, we did this to figure it out. I actually use this model at the very beginning of my presentation. We know that communicating science is hard, but storytelling holds attention. Therefore, we should use storytelling to communicate science. Very simple, very straightforward, but very, very effective. And if you'd like to delve more into using the and, but, therefore model, I highly recommend checking out the work of Randy Olson, scientist turned filmmaker, who has written extensively about how to use the and, but, therefore model in pretty much everything, especially scientific writing and public communication of science. His Twitter handle is literally @ABT Agenda. I especially recommend his most recent book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. Now, final very important lesson. People will mostly remember how you made them feel. And a filmmaker once told me that what people take away from any interaction, 80% of it will just be how you made them feel, how that story, how that content made them feel. Maybe 15% will be body language or the actual, the visual interaction, and maybe 5% will be content. What you remember from my presentation or the presentations of any of my co-panelists today, you will probably remember maybe 5% of the specific things that we told you. But I hope you will especially remember how we made you feel. And if our presenting is effective, you might remember even a bit more than 5% of that content if we made you feel a really strong, memorable emotion. If they remember how your story made them feel, they will be more likely to remember some of that content as well. So for example, I can tell you everything I learned when I visited the Daintree Rainforest in Cairns, Australia last year, about how it's the oldest rainforest on Earth and hosts an incredible diversity of plants and animals. But that would sink in much better if I first show you a beautiful image of that rainforest with bright, saturated colors to get you feel the excitement and wonder of being in the oldest rainforest on Earth in Cairns, Australia. A very important tool for visual storytelling and conveying emotion as well as information is, of course, color. There are actually two color wheels, the subtractive color wheel and the additive color wheel. They basically look like rainbows a circle. The subtract color wheel is good for print. The additive color wheel is really good for digital media because it mirrors what the human eye actually sees. So you'll notice that colors arranged opposite each other on these color wheels, these are called complementary colors. Complementary colors pair well together because they have high contrast. You'll notice on both of these wheels, blues and oranges are opposite to each other. Blues and oranges are really great to pair because blues and oranges occur in nature a lot. Blue sky and yellow or orange sunsets. Orange sunlight reflecting on blue water, or yellow sand next to blue water, orange fire against a blue sky, etc. Blue and orange occur a lot in nature, so it's a very pleasing pairing. And that's a great pairing to use in any kind of graphic design or character design. It's also really important to think about not just the colors, but also the tone, the relative brightness of the colors to each other. And this is especially important, not just in graphic design, but also photography and film, which we'll hear more about soon. So here's an example. Unfortunately, this is what much of my state of California looks like right now. We're dealing with a lot of wildfires in the last week. But check out the tone of the colors in this image. The high contrast and saturation. High contrast meaning the colors are really vibrant and they're very different from each other. They have high contrast to each other and they're saturated. They're really, really vibrant, really bright. The high contrast and the high saturation in this image gives a sense of urgency and enormity. In addition to the body language of the firefighter in the foreground. He's got his hands on his head. He looks like he just feels overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, how are we going to deal with this? Whereas in this image feels very bleak and hopeless because here the colors are desaturated. They're more dull. They have more affinity to each other. They're more similar to each other. They don't stand out next to each other. So this makes the image feel really bleak. Really dire, really hopeless. Where these people are going. Are they going to get out? Returning to a happier scene, in this image I showed you earlier of the Daintree rainforest in Australia, here we again have high contrast, the colors, and high saturation. The colors are really bright and vibrant next to each other, which makes the image feel happy and exciting and inviting. This is another photo I took in the same place. This is also the Daintree rainforest in Australia, but here the colors are desaturated. They have more affinity to each other. So if I want you to feel excited about this place, this would not be the best image to use. And as a fun example of using color and tone effectively, I encourage you to check out this cartoon by my friend Stefan Schumacher, who is one of my collaborators at Pixar Animation Studios. Stefan is an animator, and in his spare time as a passion project, he used his skills to create this cartoon to make young adults aware of shark finning, the practice of shark finning. He couches his message in a really entertaining 6-minute cartoon about some alien sharks who crash land on Earth. So you can check this out on YouTube. And I encourage you to pay attention to how he uses color and tone to tell his story. So in addition to using stories and strong visuals, it's also best to limit your content to no more than 3 main points. It's harder to remember more than 3 main points. So here are, again, my 3 main points from this talk. Think about your audience first and always keep them in mind throughout your project, and especially when you're preparing to communicate your science. Distill complexity, both scientists and artists do this, and people will most likely remember how you make them feel. And if you don't believe me yet, who did I quote as saying that stories have to be distilled? Can you remember the name? How about, where is the world's oldest rainforest? Can you remember where that oldest rainforest was? Now, which of those slides had a striking image on it? And on that note, we're going to hear from 2 incredible visual storytellers about how to use images to engage people with science. And I'm very excited to see their presentations. But first, I just want to acknowledge all the many people who have helped me develop these ideas, brainstorm these ideas, find opportunities to test out these ideas over the years. Many people at Pixar, at the UC Museum of Paleontology. And I especially want to thank again Lucia and Jennifer for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. And thank you all for attending. And if you would like to reach out to me, you can find me on social media. Please feel free to email me at sciencethroughstory@gmail.com. And if you'd like to learn more about my work, join my mailing list to find about upcoming workshops and resources available to the public. Or if you'd like to contact me, you can do so at my website, sarah-alshafi.com. And I will turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you so much.
Wow, this was amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much for such a great talk and for sharing such important lessons with us. If any of you have any questions for Sarah, please submit through the Q&A button and we'll address those questions at the end during our Q&A session. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Rohan Chakravarty. Rohan is an artist, a cartoonist, and an illustrator who created Green Humor, a series of comics on wildlife and nature conservation that are published in newspaper columns, magazines, and journals. Rohan's illustrations have been used for several projects and campaigns on wildlife awareness and conservation. He has also authored 2 books, The Great Indian Nature Trail and Bird Business, both of which I highly recommend. Rohan also won awards by the UNDP, Sanctuary Asia, WWF, and the Royal Bank of Scotland. By his own estimation, Rohan is notorious for rolling up into a ball like a pangolin to avoid meeting people. Indeed, he seems to prefer the company of birds than that of human beings. And today, Rohan will talk about his creative process and the challenge of making science fun and funny through art. Welcome, Rohan.
Thanks a lot, Losin. All right, I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah. All right, hi everyone. Thank you ATBC for having me here once again after 2018 and not being tired of me yet. My talk is called Cartoons in Conservation Communication, wherein I will try to take the baton forward from a wonderful presentation by Sarah. And for me, despite being somebody who works with the visual medium, I learned a lot from her presentation. So I hope this too will be useful for viewers here. I'll focus more on the examples of my work and how my work has, in my opinion, helped communicate science better to my audiences. A little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not very proficient with this medium, and if there are any errors from my part, please forgive them. It's also midnight in India, so if I doze off during the talk, Lucia and Jenny, please wake me up. So coming to wildlife art, before I move on to cartoons, as you all might know, wildlife art has not only been the oldest art career known to humanity, but also the oldest means of communication, because it has existed even before any kind of language had developed. And to my surprise, I'd say, there's a general disconnect that has built with this very art form that existed even before language. And why I say this is because now my talks are usually intended for audiences that do not have anything to do with science. So I usually ask them to start by identifying these 3 sets of entities that are going to appear on the screen. So this is Priyanka Chopra and her husband, Nick Jonas, who are very famous people, both in India and abroad. And everybody can identify them. Everybody's, knows these 2 people as well. But nobody quite knows what species of dragonfly this is. And this is my problem with the way information is disseminated and consumed. Why is this? Because this particular dragonfly is responsible directly for the good health of a lot of Indians. Now this is a globe skimmer. It's it's the longest migrating insect in the world. And it comes all the way from Japan to India just after the monsoons. And this is a time when mosquitoes breed in India, and the main prey of this dragonfly is mosquitoes. So our lives revolve directly around that of this dragonfly rather than Priyanka Chopra's or Donald Trump's. And yet the first 2 sets of people are more easily identifiable to my readers. So yeah, this is what I'm trying to change with my work, making information that is not easily digestible, that is not easily palatable to my audiences, a bit more fun to engage with. So who's a cartoonist? A cartoonist is an artist who has attained the skin of a 33-year-old, but has at the same time retained the maturity and the drawing skills of a 6-year-old, which is me. There are some prerequisites for doing what I do. They say a cartoonist is born and not made. And indeed, he's born because you have to be born really sick in the head to derive sadistic pleasure from offending people. You've got to have an obsession for mischief mongering, a love for anarchy, good grammar no matter what language you're working in, and good observation, often to the point of being a creep, because I watch animals do all sorts of things. What cartoons and generally communicators of science and ecology and anything that is to do with animals do is that they anthropomorphize, which is to attribute human qualities to anything that is not human. And this goes a long way in humanizing your subject, in building that one-to-one connection with the audience, with the subject and the audience. So I believe that there are three ways in which wildlife cartoons do the task of communicating science. One is to deliver a message of conservation without preaching. The second is to simplify jargon. And the third, to instill a love, respect, and curiosity for nature. So if you look at science as a pepperoni pizza, I would think of cartoons as the oregano and the chili flakes. How do cartoons deliver a conservation message without being preachy? Here's an example, a cartoon on orangutans and palm oil, which gives you the entire picture, the creature, the problem, in one simple image. How do cartoons simplify scientific jargon? Now, if I tell you that the mammary glands of the elephant are located in the pectoroaxillary region, which is the same place where human mammary glands are located, you may or may not remember or retain this information. But if you were to see this cartoon, I bet you're not forgetting this for the rest of your lives. There are some phenomenal cartoonists who are doing what I do, communicate ecology in cartoons. Some of them are Seppo from Finland, whose work I really love. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Rosemary Moscow's series Bird and Moon Comics. And of course, an insanely popular series, especially on social media, is Sad Animal Facts by Brooke Barker, who's from the US. And then there's me. My series is called Green Humor. It's a collection of cartoons, comics, and illustration on wild animals, conservation, and all things green. My mainstay is cartoons and comics, which I publish with various kinds of platforms, both in the print and the web. I'm just going to leave you to read some of my work here. The longest migrating bird in the world, which visits both the poles, I think is the only creature to do so in the entire world. A lot of my comic strips are much longer narratives, but I haven't included them in this talk because we are very short of time. These are some of my current publishers, the Universal Press Syndicate's Go Comics, which is the same syndicate that distributes Calvin and Hobbes, Dilbert, Birds Before Swine, has a page for green humor on their website. I publish with a couple of Indian newspapers, an e-magazine called Round Glass, and some print magazines as well called Savus and Aristilmachi that comes out of Turkey. Other than my columns, my newspaper and web columns, I've had the good fortune of doing cartoons and comics in collaboration with field biologists around the world, some of which I'm going to display as part of my show. So, commissioned by Seva Seas in the Seychelles, I got the opportunity to work with marine biologists. And this is a cartoon from a comic that simplifies the study of a biologist, Chandel Elston, who studied the dietary preferences of individual stingrays in the Seychelles by actually inserting a pipe to make the poor animal puke its food out. And this is one of the cartoons that simplifies the study. This cartoon was based on a paper by Claire Wordley, which sort of proved that insect-eating bats preferred coffee plantations to tea plantations in the Western Ghats of India. I recently collaborated with Pteropus and Rimba, which are bat conservation organizations in Southeast of Asia and Malaysia. And their study focused on how durian farming is impacting the conservation of bats. Now, fruit bats are interestingly the only creatures capable of naturally pollinating durian. And ironically, durian farming is impacting their very existence. Very interestingly, the last time I spoke at ATBC in 2018, which was in Malaysia, I met a botanist from Colombia called Melissa Ayala, and she was doing this very interesting initiative on an endangered species of magnolia. Now, this tree is also used to make a kitchen tool called the molinillo, which is used to stir chocolate, and chocolate is a big thing in Colombia. So what Melissa did was to get chocolate farmers and people who make this tool out of the magnolia to come together and use their indigenous knowledge to disperse the seed of the tree and thereby help conserve the endangered tree. So Melissa and I got together and did a comic strip based on her initiative, and in a bid to popularize what she was doing in Colombia. I've also collaborated with BirdLife International and ornithologists who work for BirdLife International to popularize birds. So one of my series was to compare human mothers with bird mothers and bring out their quirky characteristics. So the barnacle goose, for example, makes its goslings dive out of a cliff just the day they are born. Now, a very interesting example, which is one of my recent projects, is from a place called Karnataka in India. Karnataka is a state, and as you all know, India is big on cinema, really big on cinema, especially regional cinema. So there's this guy called Upendra, okay, who's an actor from Karnataka and a very popular actor and a dancer. And this poster was done in collaboration with a scientist who's working on an animal called the dancing frog. This frog is endangered, it's endemic, and not many people know about it. And fewer people know about why it dances. So it dances to attract a mate. And my whole plan was to compare this frog with the actor who dances and to kind of make them have a dance-off in this infographic so that people take notice. And what we also did was, if you walk in the streets of Karnataka, you will notice these hand-drawn cinema posters that are very popular in the state. So we did a similar poster with the frog to kind of popularize the very concept that the frog is a dancing film star and build a more regional and a more vernacular connect with this animal. Other than cartoons and comics, I also do a line of illustrations which I call wildlife caricatures, which look something like this. Here are the 15 species of wild cats that you find in India, all the 44 species of dolphins in the world. I've taken this beyond just pretty pictures and done campaign mascots. For example, the Mabula Crown Hornbill project mascot for BirdLife International. To the right is a mascot for a tiger reserve in India, which is home to an endemic deer called the Barasingha. I've done similar mascots and caricatures for campaigns around the world. This is an example from Borneo in Brunei, the Bornean tribe in Brunei, where all these animals are found. I also illustrated the cover for Nature, Ecology and Evolution. I think this was a 2019 issue. I've also done composite habitat illustrations using these caricatures, one of which was in association with the Save Our Seas Foundation. And this is a very challenging and a very interesting landscape to illustrate because it includes everything from bears to whales to kelp forests. So if you observe, it's a temperate rainforest meeting a kelp forest in the Great Bear National Park in Canada. And this is also home to a lot of the indigenous First Nation tribes that reside there. Other than all of this, I've also been doing a pet project called Illustrated Maps, in which I show what kind of wildlife and what kind of interactions between wildlife and communities you can expect in a given geographical area. So, for example, this is the wildlife map of India. To a lot of people, India is just about elephants and tigers and snakes, but there's so much more to India. We are one of the most geographically diverse countries in the world. We've got everything from snow-capped mountains to deserts to islands and rainforests. So here's just a glimpse of what to expect in which corner of India. I've done similar projects in other countries. For example, in my project with Bhutan, I managed to take this beyond wildlife and include a lot of elements that spoke about culture, the architecture, and the general way of life in Bhutan. Bhutan, very interestingly, has 70% of its area still under forest cover, and that's quite a lesson to learn from bigger and economically more forward countries. I've done a similar project in Hong Kong, where not many people would expect a lot of wildlife, but if you look at the microfauna, the invertebrate life, there's a lot to offer for even this cluster of concretized islands. And not just cities and countries, but also tiger reserves such as Kanha, which is a prime tiger reserve in India and holds a sizable population of our tigers. And Kanha is also home to a tribe called the Bega tribe, and some of their instances of celebrating life and celebrating wildlife are also depicted in this map. Again, adapting my art and making it evolve in order to resonate better with local communities. I have done something of which this is an example. The city of Gangtok is in the Himalayas in India, and Himalayan Buddhism has a very distinct art form called Thangka, which I have kind of hybridized with my own style and incorporated certain elements of Thangka painting into this map so that it resonates better with the local population of Gangtok. I've done maps that translate scientific data into visuals. For example, this one. If you compare both maps on the left and the right, you will get information about which bird that has been ringed in the Arctic has been caught where in India and vice versa. So this gives you an information of what bird is visiting India from which part of the world, and which Indian bird is going to which part of the world in the migrating season. Speaking about my books, my first was a comic book on Indian wildlife called The Great Indian East Trail. My second was Making Friends with Snakes. This book is meant for children living around cultivated areas, living around agriculture, who come in direct contact with snakes and snake bite, and who do not have much awareness around these issues. So this book is meant to familiarize these kids with snakes and how to tackle a snake bite when you encounter one. And my latest release is called Bird Business. It's a series of 100 illustrations that tell you how 100 species of birds from India interact with their environments, exploit the resources available to them. And it's also a book that encourages people to go just beyond watching birds to understanding birds. In my experience, being a little more than a cartoonist has helped me take my work to a large number of people. And this includes deriving sources or deriving inspiration and motivation from random sources like cinema, books and literature. I worked as an animation professional before I became a full-time cartoonist. So I did all sorts of odd jobs other than animation at the film studio. For example, I spent time in the edit room understanding how film editing works. I even did voiceovers when other professionals were not available, just to understand how, the entire science of filmmaking. And of course, animation being my previous career has had a huge impact on my cartooning as well. I'm a collector of comic books, and I collect comics even in languages I do not understand, because I believe that the power of visuals transcends the power of language. I'm a hobby singer, so of course music has a huge impact on my work. And of course, fashion magazines that I read waiting at the parlor, my mother visited for haircuts. I know nothing about fashion, but I spend time picking up a fashion magazine and just checking out what's in it so that I can do cartoons like this. Just a few examples of the influences of cinema and animation on my work. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Korean cinema, but I really love Korean cinema. This is a classic called Old Boy, and this scene has directly inspired a scene from my book Bird Business, which depicts an eagle hunting a snake. Similarly, Genndy Tartakovsky's very popular series called Samurai Jack, I pay tribute to this show in my book Bird Business, where you can see an eagle and a jungle fowl juxtaposed just the same way as Aku and Samurai Jack are in his cover. And of course, cinema keeps showing up every once in a while in my book. Cartoons do make a difference, and this is something I've realized after having seen tangible impacts of my work on the people who read them. So here's an example of a comic that actually encouraged a person in Peru to refrain from buying a pet monkey. This is a comic strip about the pygmy marmoset, the world's smallest monkey, which is impacted by the illegal pet trade. And this person, who's a reader of my Go Comics column, wrote to me saying that he was considering buying a pet monkey but refrained from doing so after reading this comic. And for me to be publishing comics from India in a portal in the USA and to have actually saved the life of a monkey in Peru is a big deal. And this is just an example of how different kinds of media today, the creative media, social media, can come together to create a much larger difference. To politics. Now, there's a bit of a paradox going on in India. There's some great science happening. This is a comic strip about recent development in which a pangolin was radio tagged. And this was the first time that's happening in probably our entire continent. And this is a huge landmark for conservation in India. But at the same time, there's some really bad governance happening. For those who have been following Indian environmental current affairs, you might know that there's something going on in India in which the government is trying to actively dilute the whole process of environmental impact assessment for industries and make it easier for businesses to come up in areas that have our existing green cover. And this is something that we have been protesting against as creative communicators. A lot of us artists have come together and are demystifying the complexities behind the legalities and the scientific aspects of this policy in order to engage a lot more people. And this has turned into a huge online movement that has actually managed to put the government on the back foot and delay the implementation of this policy. And of course, this is not just happening in India, but around the world. How have cartoons impacted my readers? This is a comic strip that I ran in an Indian newspaper about the eco-friendly sanitary products available in India. And a lot of female readers, after reading this, wrote to me saying that this comic strip inspired them to make that switch. Now, I'm a man, I know nothing about menstruation. And to have made a small difference to the lives of female readers was a huge thing to me. And of course, cartoons make a huge difference to the lives of cartoonists themselves. They are a means of expression and communication, of course, an emotional outlet. Now, any kind of art releases dopamine, which is the same effect as being in love. And to have that effect every day of your life, there's nothing better than that. A source of personal pleasure and creative satisfaction. And of course, it makes you a big magnet. I haven't had much success on this front, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Here's some places where you can follow my work if you're interested. My website, greenhumor.com, my Go Comics page. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I also have a web store that prints and ships my merchandise worldwide. The whole point of doing this on ATBC is to seek a symbiotic association with scientists and communicators and everybody who's listening. And I hope that we can come together and make your science something that is palatable, something that is enjoyable to your reader, to your audience, and hopefully have a much larger outcome of what you're doing. So I'll end this talk with this cartoon and on this note. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rohan. That was just fantastic. Your art is so beautiful. And to those of you out there who don't know, I know people are joining us from all around the world, but It is currently, I think it's 1 a.m. where Rohan is right now. So he made some sacrifices to be here with us today. So thank you for doing that. Also, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was just fantastic. So our third speaker today is Neil Losin. Neil is an award-winning documentary filmmaker based in Miami, Florida. Neil earned his PhD in biology at UCLA, studying the evolutionary ecology of anolis lizards and other systems. Now through his company, Days Edge Productions, Neil and his business partner, Nate Dappin, produce films for clients like National Geographic, the Smithsonian Channel, the World Wildlife Fund, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the National Science Foundation, and many others. Their broadcast and web documentaries about science, nature, conservation, and adventure reach millions of people around the world. Neil began his filmmaking career the way any professional should, with beer. Dos Equis, which funded his first freelance project, set him on an adventurous path and even once sent him into the hold of an Indonesian cargo ship for 2 days. Today, Neil will discuss his journey from science to science filmmaking and the power of the moving image for telling the stories of science. Take it away, Neil.
All right, unmuting myself here and gonna share my screen and get my presentation up and running. All right, hopefully everybody can see that now. I'm gonna look to my fellow panelists for confirmation that you can see the presentation now. All right, great. Yeah, my name is Neil Losin. Actually, before I introduce myself again, thank you so much for that introduction, Jenny. Thank you to Lucia and Jenny for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and thanks to you all for coming as well. As Jenny said, my name is Neil Losin, and you can see my websites and social media handles here. The most important thing on this slide, though, is actually the URL at the top. So I'm going to show a series of clips as part of this presentation because I'm a filmmaker. And this doesn't always work well over Zoom screen sharing. Sometimes they come through a little choppy. I have a pretty good internet connection, and if you do too, you might be able to watch them through the Zoom screen share. If it's coming through choppy, go to this URL. It should take you to a Vimeo page where you can actually watch the clips and stream them yourself locally on your machine. So I encourage everybody to follow that link, have it handy to watch the clips when they come up later in the presentation. And that URL will appear again whenever I'm going to show a clip. So if you didn't have a chance to copy it all down while I've been talking here, you'll have another chance. I'm going to start by talking about how I changed careers from being a scientist to being a filmmaker who tells stories about science on screen. I did my PhD on lizards called anoles, and when I started my PhD, I thought I wanted to be an academic, doing research and teaching at a university. So I spent a lot of time looking at anoles in Puerto Rico, in places like El Yunque National Forest, which is an amazing, amazing forest. The only tropical rainforest in the United States National Forest System. Unfortunately, it doesn't look much like this anymore after Hurricane Maria, but it is recovering, and I'm sure will look like this again. But in the end, I actually did most of my work in a place that looked more like this. This is a Google Street View of the place where I ended up doing a lot of my research in Miami. And that's actually me doing field work as captured by the Google Street View car as it went by one summer day. And incidentally, this is a great way to prove to your advisor that you actually were out there collecting that data that you said you were. So I ended up studying invasive species of anoles in Miami, which has an incredibly rich community of invasive species, particularly anoles. While I was working on my PhD, I was also a pretty serious wildlife photographer, and I made part of my income selling photos to books and magazines. I would find various ways to get my photos out there, sometimes accompanying articles that I'd written, and sometimes supporting stories written by other people. Then, partway through my PhD, I went on an OTS, an Organization for Tropical Studies course in Costa Rica, and met this guy, Nate Dappin. We had a lot of things in common. We were both biologists studying lizards. We were both very serious photographers. We both had long hair and, at the time, mustaches. So we started working on projects together, including making little videos about our research. And I'm going to show you a clip of one of those videos from the very beginning of my career as a filmmaker. And if you go to that URL and start it right at the beginning, you'll see this clip. I'm going to try to play it here over Zoom. And if it doesn't come through clearly, feel free to mute the Zoom temporarily and watch it through that link. Okay, I'm going to wait a few seconds for everybody to come back if people left and streamed that video on their own. And that should be an indication of how things are going to work when I run another clip. So if I get to another clip in the presentation and this one didn't work well for you, the next ones probably will not work well for you either. And it will make sense to immediately go to the external link and stream it on your end rather than trying to have this one be successful again. Anyway, so those were the kinds of little outreach films that I was making as a PhD student to try to bring the research that I was doing to a broader audience. Oh, all right, there we go. And making those videos for outreach was really fun. It engaged both my scientific and artistic sides, and I started to wonder whether this could actually be a career. I thought this work could be really important. There's data to support the idea that films play an important role in science communication. Most adults get their information about science, sorry about that. Most adults get their information about science from TV and the internet, at least in the United States, which are both realms where video reigns supreme. And for better or for worse, people tend to trust documentaries and other science video programs quite a bit. These statistics from 2017 show that documentaries and other videos are the most common source, sorry, let's keep skipping ahead on me, the most common source of science information for Americans, aside from general news outlets. They're also the most trusted source of information about science, except science museums. But far more people watch science videos and documentaries than visit science museums. So that combination of being frequently used and highly trusted makes science documentaries a very powerful way to communicate science, at least in the United States. Our first serious attempt at a film beyond the outreach videos we'd done as graduate students came shortly after we finished our PhDs in 2012. We applied for a grant from Dos Equis, the beer company, to fund our idea because, of course, that's where you go for funding your science videos, right? What this meant was submitting a video to an online competition, begging everyone we knew to cast votes for us, and eventually going to a special ceremony in New York City where the most interesting man in the world, the spokesman for Dos Equis, awarded us the first ever Stay Thirsty grant. And this was followed by a party where Diplo was the DJ and Andrew WK played the pipe organ. It was a very, very strange night. And just a few months after that, we found ourselves crossing a glacier on the equator in Uganda's Ruwenzori Mountains. Our goal was to recapture photos of the glaciers that had been first taken in 1906 by an Italian expedition that made the first documented ascents of these mountains. This turned out to be really hard for a lot of reasons, but in the end, we did manage to capture some of these before and after images that really tell the story of how this place changed from 1906 to 2013 when we made our expedition. And virtually all of the glaciers, the famous glaciers of the Ruwenzori Mountains, had disappeared. So we filmed this expedition and it became our first big project after finishing our PhDs. You can watch it online. It's about 20 minutes long. It's free. Just search for Snows of the Nile. And basically it's an adventure story. It's about our quest to capture these repeat glacier photos. So there is a strong climate change message in the film, but the story itself is not about climate change. It's a simple quest. And we found that audiences at film festivals and online really connected with the film. They were, of course, amazed to see the changes in glacier coverage that our photographs revealed, but they were also entertained by the journey and the challenges and the failures that we encountered in pursuit of those images. Now, with that previous example, we had to gauge our success by our subjective impressions of the film's impact on audiences. But I want to share another case study where we actually evaluated our film's success in changing our audience's attitudes. The film is called Islands of Creation. It's a 1-hour documentary we made for the Smithsonian Channel with funding from the National Science Foundation. And the story follows Al Uy, who's a professor at the University of Rochester, who studies speciation in the birds of the Solomon Islands. As a character, Al is not necessarily what you expect to see in a science documentary on TV. He's a young, charismatic, Filipino-American biologist, and he has a wonderful, intimate relationship with the communities where he does his research. One Solomon Islands family has even adopted Al and treats him as if he were their own son. There's some really great science in this film, but the story is really about Al and his journey toward understanding his own place in the world. And here is a little part of that story toward the end of the film. I'm going to play this again over Zoom. If you want to watch it on your end, again, go to that URL, skip to 36 seconds into that video and hit play, and you should see the same clip that I'm going to stream over Zoom right now. All right, I'm going to give folks a few seconds to come back from their streaming on their machines if they were watching the clip elsewhere. Skip ahead now. So as I mentioned, we were really interested in how this film would influence audiences, not just in terms of their factual knowledge, but also in their perceptions and attitudes about science and scientists in general. So we hired an external evaluator to do some studies with focus groups, and they compared people's knowledge and attitudes before and after watching this film. And not surprisingly, watching a documentary about how new species arise did teach people some things about evolution and speciation. The film had a large effect on the audience's content knowledge, particularly female audiences for reasons that are not entirely clear to us, and our analysis wasn't able to determine. But in any case, in viewers of both sexes, large effects on their ability to correctly answer questions about evolution and speciation. But as I mentioned, we were also interested in their perceptions. So we had a series of items in the questionnaire designed to reveal the audience's attitudes about science and scientists. They were asked to what extent they agreed with statements like, "I personally think that science is extremely valuable to society." Or on the flip side, "I personally believe that scientists are boring." And when we combined their responses to these questions into a single composite measure, a science perception score, we found that watching our film did have an effect on the audience's perception of science. It's more subtle than the film's effect on content knowledge, but it's still statistically significant, and it represents about half a standard deviation improvement in this metric. So roughly the equivalent of going from the 50th to the 70th percentile in those responses. So we showed in a small way, at least, that telling a good story, a story that contains real science, but also highlights the human side of scientists, can help build an audience's science knowledge, of course, but also improve their attitudes about science. As our business has grown, we've become increasingly interested in producing films that have real measurable impact. And I love that the other panelists have already talked about this. And in fact, what I'm going to say about this mirrors a lot of what Sarah said in her presentation about considering the audience first. So one possible framework for thinking about impact storytelling starts with defining the impact that you want to create. So what is your desired impact? What is the message that you want to convey? Who is the audience that you want to convey that message to? And then what is your ask? What would you actually like the audience to do with the message that you're giving them? Once you've defined that impact, now it's time to think about what you can actually create to achieve that impact. So what will the format be? Is it a video? Is it a virtual reality experience? Is it a photo essay? It can be all kinds of things. And if it's a video, how long is it? You know, short videos and long, feature films have very different audiences. How is it going to be distributed? How will it actually reach your audience? And then finally, the very last step in this process is, what is the story? What is the actual story you're going to tell? Who is the protagonist? What is the conflict in the story? What are the stakes? And why will your audience care? And this process kind of flips the traditional storytelling process on its head, right? You're thinking about the story as the very last step once you've kind of already defined a lot of what you want the story to do for you out in the world. One example where we thought a lot about impact is a film called A Ghost in the Making, which is about this rare vanishing bee called the rusty-patched bumblebee. We worked with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and they had a specific goal: to get this bee protected as an endangered species under the US Endangered Species Act. The film follows the quest of a photographer, Clay Bolt, as he tries to find and photograph this bee before it disappears. We decided to make this a short film. It's still a little long by web standards, but it's not as long as something that would go on TV or be shown in a theater. It's about 20 minutes long. And when we launched this film online, we released it in tandem with an online petition on change.org. And the goal was to gather signatures to deliver to the US Fish and Wildlife Service in support of giving this species federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. And we ended up delivering to the US Fish and Wildlife Service almost 130,000 signatures from the public. Many of those people went on to leave public comments directly on the government's website regarding this listing decision. And some US Fish and Wildlife employees told us that the level of public engagement that they saw on this listing decision was way beyond what they typically see in these cases, which is a pretty cool thing to hear when the animal that's being considered for protection is an insect. And then in 2017, early 2017, about 9 months after our film was released, the rusty-patched bumblebee was officially listed under the Endangered Species Act. It was the first North American bee to receive federal protection of any kind, and actually the first species of any kind to receive endangered species protection under the Trump administration. And already this listing decision is having another kind of impact on the ground. So when populations of this bee species were rediscovered in the proposed path of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in Virginia, environmental groups were able to block the permits for the pipeline, which ultimately caused the fossil fuel companies behind the pipeline to abandon the project. Okay, so you may be wondering, and it's a totally reasonable thing to wonder, whether it's possible to actually make a living producing science media. And the answer is yes. I don't know any secret formula for doing it, but I can tell you more or less how our business works. And I think the best way to do that is actually to take a walk through one specific project, a major project, and sort of see how it came together. One of our dreams for a long time was to create a big film about anoles because they're among the most important organisms for our understanding of biology. They've become sort of a model system for understanding evolution, ecology, behavior, even development. But most people have no idea that these little lizards that many people can see right in their backyards have played this amazing role in science. So we wanted to rectify that situation. So I'm going to start by showing you another clip. It's a clip from the introduction of the final film that we made in this project. And then after I show the clip, I'll show you how we got there. So there are a couple clips that were originally in the presentation that I took out because of length. So to watch this one, you're going to skip ahead following that same URL to 424 and hit play. And then you'll see this thing that I'm now going to play through Zoom as well. And I'll see you all again in about a minute. All right, again, I'll give people a few seconds to come back if they were streaming that outside of Zoom before moving on here. Oh. So the way that project started was long ago when we were still grad students. Nate and I approached Jonathan Lassos and wrote a grant together to produce a bunch of videos about anoles. And Jonathan Lassos is sort of the guy at the center of the anole universe. He was at Harvard University, now at Washington University, and almost everybody who works on anoles has some kind of connection to Jonathan. He's also a wonderful, kind, generous guy and a really fun guy to get in front of your camera. So we were unsuccessful the first time we applied for funding, and actually the second time we applied for funding as well. But eventually we did manage to secure some funding to do some outreach work through the Templeton Foundation. And the funding was to produce a series of 7 short films about anoles, featuring lots of different anole researchers. And you can see these films on YouTube, they're free. The series is called The Lizard's Tale, and there are seven episodes. And that was basically phase 1 of the project, was getting this grant funding from the Templeton Foundation to produce 7 short films for the web about different aspects of anole research. But as I mentioned, we had grander aspirations than just a series of short films on the web, so we used the Templeton funds strategically. Once we got ourselves to various locations to film the short films, we filmed extra scenes that we envisioned using in a broadcast documentary. We also found other partners to help offset these increased production costs. So we made a short film for the web magazine Biographic. We also partnered with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute to make a classroom science video. And HHMI makes classroom science videos that are distributed to thousands of classrooms around the United States and elsewhere in the world. And so phase 2, while it involved getting some other partners involved to help us pay for some extra shooting at additional locations, it also helped us in another way, which was bringing on these partners that could distribute these stories in ways that our original 7 short films weren't reaching people. So for example, the classroom science audience is very different from the online audience for science films. It's also almost a completely non-overlapping set of people we were able to reach. So as you can see in the little pie chart, we've added a bit to the overall budget here with these 2 additional partners. And finally, at this stage, we were ready to approach a broadcaster to pitch this as a 1-hour television special. Now, it's not an easy pitch to get a broadcaster on board with a whole hour of television about little lizards that you can find in your backyard. But once the Smithsonian Channel saw some of our footage and we explained how cool anoles were, and we demonstrated to them that virtually all the footage was actually captured already and all they would have to pay for is post-production, we actually got them on board with the project. And the result was Laws of the Lizard, which I think is the first and only TV documentary that's entirely about anoles. It aired for the first time the day after Christmas, 2018, and it actually won the Grand Helix Award at the 2018 Science Media Awards, which is one of the biggest awards in our industry. So the film turned out really well. So to recap, phase 3 was bringing on a broadcaster once production was nearly finished to fund the post-production and distribution of this 1-hour documentary. It was a complicated process, but making films is expensive, and it often takes bringing many partners to the table to make it happen. And a side advantage of this kind of approach is that it also allows us to create different products for different audiences. Sorry about that. And expand the reach and hopefully the impact of the project by doing so. Okay, so in conclusion, I've told you a bit about myself, how I got into this career of producing science films, why I think science films can do good in the world, and a bit about how it actually works as a business. If you're interested in doing this as a career, your formal training in the sciences can be an asset. It certainly helps us interact with scientists, find cool science stories. And formal training in media production can also be helpful, but there are other ways to develop those skills as well. So we, for example, are almost entirely self-taught in our company, and we still manage not to make complete fools of ourselves in this industry. The other piece of advice I typically give to early career folks is that you should really start now with whatever you want to do in science communication, whether it's filmmaking or anything else. Whatever you're doing with your life at this moment, I guess pandemic aside, you're likely to get more busy as time goes on, not less. And so now is always the time to acquire and practice new skills. By the time Nate and I finished our PhDs, we had made about 10 short films between us, entirely by the seat of our pants, with no budget, no training. And yet that was actually the portfolio that we used to convince our very first paying clients to pony up and actually hire us. The flip side of this, though, is that you don't have to become a professional storyteller to be part of great, impactful science storytelling. And hopefully some of the examples I've shown you demonstrate that cool things can happen when working scientists partner closely with professional media creators. We are not the only filmmakers who are excited to work with scientists. There are lots out there, and we know a lot of them. So I'm always happy to connect researchers with other filmmaking and outreach professionals, or to, get involved ourselves if we seem like the best partner on a particular project. And then finally, there's funding to be found in all kinds of places. And with enough creativity and persistence, you can get really cool projects supported in all kinds of different ways that you might not expect. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for being such an attentive audience. And I'll go ahead and wrap things up here, and so we can go to the panel discussion. I will unshare my screen now. Thank you so much.
Wow, this was really incredible, Neil. Thank you so much for an amazing talk and for sharing such great videos and stories with us. This was super exciting and very, very inspiring. Again, if anyone has any questions to Neil, Sarah, or Rohan, please submit them using the Q&A button, and we will answer as they come. Let me actually get our Q&A session started with the first question to Neil. So Neil, you told us during your talk, you told us a bit about your trajectory, but since a lot of our viewers during this webinar are biologists by training, just like you, Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey and how this transition into science communication happened to complement some of the things you told us?
Yeah, sure. What I like to say is that it helped a lot to have a partner to do it with. I think it's a very scary transition to make on your own. It's still a bit intimidating to make it with a close partner. In this case, you know, my business partner, Nate Dappin, is also one of my best friends. We made the decision together. We were both wrapping up our PhDs at the same time. We made the decision together not to apply for any traditional postdocs, but instead to start a freelance science media company and try to make that work. And it was a lot less scary to make that transition having each other to lean on and to rely on than it would have been to try to do that completely on my own. So it's a rare thing, and you can't force it. But if you do find somebody that you really click with and could see working closely with for the rest of your life, which is kind of what I anticipate with this partnership, then that really helps a lot. The other thing I would say is you know, again, I guess I would just reiterate, you know, how important it was for us to have started this process while we were in grad school. I think a lot of people come to us and want, they think that all they need is an opportunity. They need somebody to give them a break to get a foothold in an industry. And there is some truth to that, but I think the people who are successful in the industry often create those opportunities for themselves. And one way to do that is just to start making things, whatever it is you want to make. You know, if it's films, then start making films. But if you haven't made any, then you won't have any way to prove to anybody that you can do it. So it helped us a lot having spent a lot of our free time, particularly in the last couple of years of grad school, out filming stuff, editing stuff, neglecting our social relationships to spend time on these projects so that we actually had something to show for it when we decided to try to make it a career.
Thanks so much, Neil. That was great. This is a question for Rohan. So your brother's a biologist and you actually work together pretty frequently. How has the combination of the skill shared by you and your brother helped you grow as a science communicator?
Well, we haven't really worked on a project per se, but he's my go-to person to verify a lot of information that I haven't really, verified myself. And both him and even my wife, who happens to be a wildlife biologist, are very I would say very reliable critics of my work, and I don't think I publish anything substantial without their opinion. So yeah, I think having two biologists in the family has been very helpful.
Thank you so much, Rohan. And now actually a question for Sarah. Sarah, where can our webinar viewers find some resources for developing their science communication skills and storytelling?
If you search the internet, you'll find all kinds of things. If you go to my website, actually, I have a curated list of science communication resources that I recommend to help people get started. It's basically the list that I wish I had 5 years ago when I started doing this work. So that can also be a good place to start. And there's a lot of links on my website as well. Also, if you check out those open access papers that I mentioned from the symposium that I ran, those links are also on my website. They're all free. And if you want more of like academic background on these topics, there are a lot of citations in those papers that can be helpful as well. So yeah, that can be a helpful place to start. And I also would love to just echo what Neil said about if you're interested in doing this kind of work, don't wait to get started. Do it now, even if you're still in school. It's a great time. I really appreciated Neil sharing that, and I absolutely echo it with my own experience. And And if you look at those papers from that symposium, you'll find many examples from other graduate students who had a passion for something in addition to their science, and they found a way to combine the two and start using that to do science outreach in some form, and that has now shaped their careers that they've gone on to pursue. So yeah, just start experimenting with things now.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. I am actually going to share something in the chat here, which is a list of resources that we all, that our speakers put together, sort of assembled for everyone. And it's just a list of resources about science communication. So that should help everybody out, I think. The next question is for Neil. How can our webinar viewers connect with and develop partnerships with mainstream media, especially considering that ATBC has members based all around the world?
Sorry, unmuting. That's a really good question. So I think one great way to do it is that even no matter where you are in the world, if you're working in partnership with a university, if you're faculty at a university, if you're a grad student at a university, many universities have media and communications and film programs on campus that are full of students who are picking up the skills to make films, but often are in search of great stories to tell. And I think partnering with people who are learning how to make films is a great way to get started. It's often a free way to get started because people can, work on a project for you for course credit. If you're ready to make the investment, in a professional science communicator helping you get your message across, then there are certainly, most of the people that I know the best are here in the US where I operate, but certainly many of those folks will come to you wherever you are in the world and will be happy to, to help you tell stories about your science. Yeah, I guess I know less about connecting with, particular science communicators in other countries, but I can always rack my brain if somebody has a specific question about a specific country and whether they I know any great filmmakers there. At the moment, I don't know of any sort of centralized resource where people can find the kinds of professionals in our industry, no matter where they are. That would be a great thing if it existed. Some friends of mine just launched a site online where you can find female conservation and science communicators, filmmakers specifically, that I think is expected to have a global reach, but just launched today or yesterday, and the name of which I am blanking on at the moment because it is brand new. But I can find it and put it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Neil. We actually have a question here through our Q&A that is very closely related to this, which is, so what would you and Rohan and Sarah recommend? Like, should scientists first try to translate their own messages, or should they try to collaborate, hire professionals to communicate their work? Do you think that, scientists can learn these amazing skills and technology and be efficient in communicating science? What would be your general recommendations, which builds very nicely in what Neil has already told us?
I can jump in.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Rohan.
After you, sir. After you, sir.
I'll just jump in because I gave a brief response to this question already, but I think both are really great to do. I encourage everybody to work on science communication skills because a little bit goes a long way. Even spending a little bit of time, even just watching this webinar or reading a book or reading a paper really, really helps, because even if you're thinking just a little bit about how to make your communication more effective, that's going to make a huge difference between putting some effort in and not thinking about it at all. And that's really great, not just for your own efforts, but it also prepares you to collaborate efficiently and effectively with specialists, with artists, filmmakers, cartoonists, etc. If you do want to reach out and work with specialists who can really enhance your efforts and take it to an even more professional level. So I would say both.
So I've done a workshop for scientists on cartoon drawing in my previous session at the ATBC, and a lot of scientists since then have been using cartoons on platforms like social media to communicate the conclusions of their studies, and they've been doing a very effective job at it. So yeah, I think it's possible both ways. And even if they fall short a certain way, you know, it does make way for a larger collaboration. So I think, yeah, if you want to, you know, get your hands muddy, now's the right time.
Sorry, you're waiting for an answer from me too.
I think it's actually my bad. I think I'm supposed to go on to another question.
Okay.
So let's see here. So this is a question for Sarah again. As a scientist who has your own research program and a science communicator who conducts workshops and spearheads symposia, how do you juggle all the work that you do? And what advice would you have for aspiring science communicators about making ends meet while also juggling a career in science?
It's a good question, and I appreciate the question. You know, I think that doing both at once, both my PhD and the science communication work, has actually made me more focused and efficient in conducting my dissertation research, both because I knew I had to in order to have time to do the science communication work, but also because doing the other work to build my career while in grad school continuously reminded me that my dissertation doesn't have to be perfect. You know, my whole career is not riding on this one piece of work. It's going to be built on a whole bunch of things, as Neil was saying earlier. It needs to be good, but other things are going to be important too, like building the professional skills and getting different kinds of experience. And so, again, as Neil was saying, it was really valuable to start getting that experience as a grad student rather than waiting until afterward. I think it also helps that science and science communication complement each other. So doing the science makes me excited to communicate it, and doing the science communication makes me want to have good science to communicate. Now, for anyone who wants to pursue science communication while getting a science degree, I think, number one, it's really important to find support and mentorship, hopefully from your advisor, but also from other people as well. Find people who support what you're trying to do. Find them within your institution, but also expand your network outside of your institution. And that's also very important. Think about your university or your home institution as your home base, but not your fortress. And the more you do that, the more you'll be able to build your career, get different kinds of experience, and even find ways to make some extra income along the way. I started doing my workshops 4 years ago as a volunteer, just as a passion project, just to get the experience. And after so many workshops, I started getting paid an honorarium for my time. And then I started I got hired to teach a short course on science communication at my university at UC Berkeley. And then I started getting consulting gigs. And now, as I'm about to graduate and finish my PhD, now I'm actually starting my own LLC. So I think thinking early on or whenever you get interested in these things about what your priorities are and how to balance them, and finding mentorship and support and just seeking opportunities. And again, don't wait to start exploring things and experimenting with stuff. Just start doing it just for fun at first, but keep an eye out for opportunities to actually use that somehow.
Thanks, Sarah. This is super helpful, super insightful. And now actually a question for Rohan, which is, so what advice would you give to any aspiring artists out there who wish to develop their own portfolio?
Well, like I said in my talk, it helps to be a little more than an artist. You know, you've got to have several sources of inspiration and motivation. You've got to actively, seek new sources of inspiration. So for me, it could be anything from having met an actual, an interesting species on a nature trail, to reading about something that I've never seen before, and even combining various other sources. For example, the cinema I watch, the music I listen to, the stuff I cook. Some way or the other finds its way into what I draw. So yeah, I think you've got to be very open to the world around you and very observant about things. And of course, it's also at the end of the day very important as a cartoonist to not take yourself very seriously. So I think that's the most important piece of advice I'd like.
So let's see. Here's another question for Rohan, actually. What do you consider effective science communication, and what should people be looking for while trying to communicate science?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. What do you consider effective science communication? What should people be looking for while trying to communicate their science?
As a cartoonist, it's important for me to be reading light and not be reading heavy. So that's what I aspire to do with whatever science I communicate. Even if it's another means of communication other than cartoons, I think something that resonates as local as possible is, I think, very good communication. Something that is something that gives the audience a sense of ownership of what he's watching. I think that is effective science communication. So again, as a cartoonist, I aspire to do that. Go as vernacular, as local as I can in my art, and also to keep it open to a wide age group, and to not restrict it to a certain section of society or a certain demographic. I think the more inclusivity there is in your communication, the better communicator you become.
Great, thank you, Rohan. And here's a question for Neil, which is, so someone is asking if there are papers where people can read about, the tests on film success and the science perception scores.
Yeah, so there are a few papers on such things. There was just a really interesting paper that I can maybe share the link to I think it was in PLOS One, about the success of Planet Earth 2 in engaging audiences in conservation issues. So there's starting to be sort of a smattering of peer-reviewed papers on this, but there's also, at least for projects that are funded through the National Science Foundation in the US, there's a large database of case studies of these impact studies of all kinds of different science communication endeavors that are all assembled through a group called the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, CAISE is the acronym. And so if you go to caise.org, I believe, you can actually search these impact reports or these evaluations of all sorts of different science communication initiatives that have been funded by the National Science Foundation over the years. And there's a huge repository of that kind of information there.
So I have a question for all the speakers. How can we get a greater diversity of science stories out there?
I guess by interacting with a larger base of readers, and also I think for a platform like ATBC, it's it facilitates a much larger conversation by bringing in people from all around the world. So I think I would like to believe that process is already underway, and I hope a lot of scientists from various parts of the world are going to approach us in order to make not just their communication better, but even people like learn more and enrich our art forms and careers respectively.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole separate full day webinar on this topic. Actually, my department just did that earlier this week. But in short, I think in addition to what Rohan said, encourage a greater diversity of people to study science and to pursue careers in science or science communication or art or related, and encourage all scientists everywhere to share their stories and to work with artists.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I mean, in the medium of film, you can think about diversity in front of the camera in the stories that are being told, but also diversity behind the camera. And so, you know, in front of the camera, I think we as storytellers should always be cognizant of who we're choosing, whose stories we're choosing to tell. And I think in science storytelling, that means, you know, trying to look for diverse scientist voices in your stories, but it also means telling science stories about people who aren't scientists. You know, I think that's really important. Like, there's lots of stakeholders in science who aren't actually the people doing the science. And that's another way to, you know, to tell the stories of a more diverse, you know, community of people in our science storytelling. I can say, you know, from our perspective at Days Edge Productions, I think every project that we're currently actively pitching has some sort of pretty significant diversity, equity, or inclusion aspect to it. Even though we are two white dudes, I think on the behind the camera side, you know, again, I'm a white male, American cis het, you know, there's like, I'm pretty much the definition of someone who does not qualify as improving diversity in any way. But I think what people like me in this industry can do, even though, you know, I'm fairly early in my career, is try to share our expertise, the lessons that we've learned with as broad an audience as possible. And so one thing that our company has done since the very beginning is to lead workshops in science filmmaking, like immersive, you know, 3 to 7 day long hands-on workshops to build filmmaking skills. And we decided early on that any workshop that we organized was going to be free to all the participants. And that's made possible by partnering with organizations who actually pay us. So we're not taking our compensation for running these workshops from participants directly. We're taking them from the commissioning organizations, and the participants don't have to pay for anything. And that really allows us to recruit from a much broader and more diverse pool of potential, you know, trainees and learners in this industry, because there are huge obstacles to entry to this industry. Cameras are expensive. It takes time to learn how to use them and to edit, and you need a fast computer to edit video. You know, like, there's a lot of obstacles, and we really don't want our training opportunities that we're able to provide to be another one of those obstacles to people entering this industry.
It's a really, really important point. It's awesome that your workshops are open to everyone, Neil. I'd love to echo two things that Neil just said. One, that yes, take workshops. If you're interested in building skills, you don't have to do it all on your own or figure it out from scratch. You can learn a lot from people who put together trainings. All three of us, myself, Neil, and Rohan, as you've heard, we all do workshops, and we spend a lot of time trying to train other people how to fish, so to speak. So any of us, you can learn skills from any of us, and there are so many other great workshops out there as well. And also, I want to echo what Neil said about consider featuring different characters and different voices in your stories. One thing that I always do in my workshops and getting people to think about who is the main character in your story is thinking about who would be the most appropriate character for the particular audience that you're trying to reach. And again, the goal that you have for that audience. Who should the story be about? Yourself conducting the study if you are the scientist, or is it about a different scientist who was doing the work, or is it about a stakeholder who was being impacted in some way by the study? Or is it the study subject? As in many of Rohan's cartoons, the characters in the cartoons were the animals themselves. So that's another way to get lots of different voices and perspectives into science stories.
That's really great. Another question to all the speakers, which is, so impact is really an important part of your work. And how would you actually define impact, and why is it important?
I think the tangibility of a particular action that has resulted from your work, I think that would define impact for me. And something very important is going on right now in India. So a lot of creative communicators have, artists of different kinds, cartoonists, even filmmakers, stand-up comedians have come together to protest against the environment impact policy of the government that I told you about during my talk. And this is happening at a time where people cannot go out and protest on the streets because there's a pandemic going on and people are in lockdown. So the government has actually been taking advantage of this situation and trying to pass a lot of acts and policies online by virtue of Zoom conferences, which are not accessible to a large population in India because they do not have internet connection. They do not. They are not. They don't even have smartphones and computers. So it's happening at a time when there's a pandemic going on and people are falling back on creative methods of communication for information like this to be simplified and reaching to them. And this has kind of created a very large online movement. So, and this is, the impact of this has been unprecedented in a sense that 17 lakh responses have been recorded against that particular policy. And this is entirely driven by creative communication online. So for me, this is a successful, I'd say a successful direction in which art has collectively taken an entire population. And I think instances like these are only bound to increase in the days to come.
So I guess I would say, from my perspective, impact, it's a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different kinds of things. I mean, I think science communication can be aimed at increasing science literacy and science knowledge in an audience. And we know from studies like the ones that Sarah shared that stories are a great way to convey science information, right? But they're also a great way to change people's attitudes and create an emotional connection. And so I think, beyond just increasing the science literacy of an audience, whoever your audience may be, creating impact might mean changing their attitudes about the whole enterprise of science or the trustworthiness of scientists. Or it could be something as specific as convincing a couple of particular policymakers to change their votes on a particular piece of legislation. I think impact encompasses so many things, and that's why I think, and obviously this mirrors things that Sarah was saying in her presentation. I think, thinking about impact initially, thinking about what you want your science communication to accomplish is really important to designing that communication to best serve that impact goal.
Absolutely. And I would even argue that in many instances, the primary goal of science communication needs to be making people feel something, making the content emotionally resonate with your audience. Because if you do that, then again, they're more likely to remember even that 5%, maybe even more of the content. If you don't make it meaningful for people, they're not going to remember anything and they're not going to be motivated to act on it. So I think that's, the impact starts with that. And in addition to, Rohan and Neil talked about the big measurable ways of impact that you can have, either by organizing efforts and demonstrating, or by doing evaluation studies of the impact of your content on the specific audience. But I also want to emphasize that not all impact is going to be measurable, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Any conversation that you have with somebody may well have a profound impact potentially on their lives, or even a short one. You never know what that can lead to. And, a lot of people ask me, well, I want to have the biggest impact possible. So how should I use social media for that? Especially if I want to reach out to like people who don't already accept climate change or don't accept evolution or et cetera. And I always say, you know, you can do outreach on social media if you want to. That is one avenue that you can use. And if you're going to share things on social media, the benefit is that you can reach a lot of people at once, of course. The con is you can only do that in very small bite-sized amounts, and people are going to see that, you know, momentarily and then possibly forget it. If you do it consistently, then they're more likely to see it regularly, but you might have a short impact spread very widely. Whereas if you have a conversation with somebody, or if you are an educator and you're teaching just a handful of students, you might have a very deep, profound impact on a smaller group of people, but what the small group of people takes from that interaction is going to propagate through the rest of their lives to all kinds of other people. So I think both types of impact are really important, and always remember that even just having a conversation with somebody makes a big difference.
I would love to add one more thing, sort of building on what Sarah said. I think, you know, there is often an emphasis on, a lot of people think that the goal of their science communication should be convincing people who don't believe something to believe it. And I think that that is important. And it is one goal of science communication, but it's also one of the most difficult goals of any science communication. And there's really important work to be done to just galvanize and inspire people who are already into science, people who are already into nature. You know, when we did that project with the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, we weren't trying to get, you know, people who didn't care at all about nature to care about a bee. We were just trying to motivate people who were already out there, who love nature, who might never have heard of this organism before, to give us a few keystrokes and add their signature to an online petition, right? We were just trying to find those people who were already predisposed to think that this bee was awesome and deserved protection, and bring them to one place where they could collectively make a difference. And they did. And so I think, you know, not every bit of science communication has to be about persuading the unpersuadable.
So this is a question for everyone. So for scientists out there who want to communicate their science, but just don't think they have the time to do it on their own, how can they engage a professional science communicator like you all, or other science communicators out there?
Again, I just want to reiterate, you don't have to become a master storyteller or a master artist. Even learning some basics and getting a working knowledge of the media that you want to work with goes a long way and will make a huge difference in your efforts. That said, it also prepares you to collaborate with professionals who can help you create content. You can find all kinds of science communication specialists just by searching for keywords on the internet. If you're looking for recommendations to get started, of course, we shared our combined list of resources in the chat. So there's lots of great things to check out there. And also, of course, you can reach out to any of us if any of us might be of help to you, or if you're looking for talents beyond our own, we'd be happy to recommend anybody else that we know that might fit what you're looking for, and make recommendations accordingly.
I would add that physically going to the places when we're not in a pandemic anymore, physically going to the places where these kinds of professionals gather is a great way to connect with them. So if there's an environmental film festival that runs in your town or your community or at your university, go there. You're likely to meet some filmmakers who are interested in telling stories about the environment and about science. If there's a conference on science communication in your community, you know, there's a number of these now in the US, ComSciCon and a variety of others. And, you know, people come from all over to learn from other science communicators, to share their latest, you know, findings, and And that's a great place also to connect with them. And it's, you know, for some of us, depending on if you're an introvert or an extrovert, and your social tendencies, that might be an easier way than cold emailing somebody out of the blue. It might be easier to go and, you know, share a beer with some people and just get some ideas flowing and find your collaborations that way.
And we've included a lot of links to events like that or resources like that in that document that Lucia and Jennifer shared.
I operate on a more individual and a one-to-one level, so reaching out to me is as simple as buying me a coffee and discussing your paper with me over it. So, yeah.
Great. Another question here is, so someone is asking whether it's advisable to plan a short documentary or a cartoon series on a published research paper.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest thing you can do is just email it to me, and if I find it interesting enough, I'll write back to you.
I think, yeah, I think the news, the science news ecosystem is one where there are fewer and fewer specialized science reporters, and more of like the news that you see about new scientific discoveries, new papers, comes in the form of copied and pasted news releases from universities that generally go through some sort of centralized news release service called, you know, Eureka Alert or something like that. And I'll definitely say that, like, you know, there are very few news outlets, certainly here in the US, and I imagine the situation is similar elsewhere, who are going to go to the trouble of like making a video about your cool science. But if that video comes as part of a news release, you know, websites love video. Video gets eyeballs, video gets clicks. And so if your news release comes with a slick little, you know, 2-minute video that explains your findings, that might be a great way to get it out to more people. You know, that might make that news release that much more appealing when these news editors are going through hundreds of releases each day, trying to figure out what are the cool science stories of the day.
I'm really glad that Neil brought up press releases, and I'd love to add that many institutions and universities have a media office whose job it is to write press releases about new cool things happening at their institution. And I think a lot of grad students don't realize this, but you can totally reach out to your media office at your university and let them know when you have a study coming out and ask if they would help you write a press release about it. That's what they do. And I also want to add that as Neil said, if you have footage or if you have really great photographs readily available, that really, really helps with press coverage and outreach efforts when you are ready to communicate the science. So again, it's great to start thinking about this as you go, not just when the study's already done, because if you're already thinking while you're doing the field work or while you're conducting the experiment in the lab, oh, it would be really great to get a shot of this person pipetting this into this dish, or this person standing on this edge looking out onto the horizon for this bird, or whatever it is. Think about that as you go. Get those shots, and even getting some cell phone footage in the field of like a really important moment in your field work, whether you're going to use it or not later. You never know when that might come in handy. So document as you go.
This is a question for Neil from one of our viewers. Which basic equipment would you recommend to buy to start making short films with invertebrates, arachnids in particular?
Sorry, I was muted there. That's a great question. Highly dependent on what your budget is. You know, you can do wonderful things with, you know, an iPhone with a clip-on macro lens attachment. If you're looking for something more specialized, you know, some of the Sony and Panasonic mirrorless cameras come in at like a really competitive price point these days and allow you to capture amazing quality footage. I do think, like, you know, a dedicated macro lens, or at least a macro conversion lens of some kind, if you're shooting on something like a smartphone, is going to be important for the smaller critters. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of having sturdy camera support. So most people don't realize that on a typical film set, the tripod is often the most expensive piece of equipment on the entire set, more expensive than the camera itself. So having a tripod that can support your equipment, whatever it is, and allow it to move smoothly while you're filming without vibrating your camera is just as important as having a good camera.
I'll also add a quick tip, building on Neil's comment about the importance of tripods and having a steady shot, and adding to my previous comment about document as you go. Even just getting a really tiny, show you mine right here, this holds my light, just a little tiny tripod like this. They're very inexpensive, they're really flexible. Even having one of these with you in the field or in the lab makes a huge difference between having a steady, stable frame and a really jittery shot, which is painful to look at. So I highly recommend getting one of these.
We're now getting close to an end here. In fact, we passed the hour already. So maybe just to wrap up, a final question to all speakers, which would be, so is there any final thoughts, recommendations, and take-home messages to communicating science effectively that you would like to share?
As scientists, I'd really like to see this happening more often. That you know, I think a lot of science still happens in Latin, and it's not palatable to people like me. So I really want science to go beyond that, and yeah, I'm here to help you do that. So yeah, scientists really need to stop taking themselves seriously, and yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll close with that.
That's a great one. I would say, you know, the best science, I think, today, and the best communication as well, comes from collaboration. It comes from teamwork. And I think, you know, it's really tempting, particularly when you're early in your career and you might not feel like you have a lot of institutional support or mentorship, to feel like you have to become the one man or one woman band and you have to do everything yourself. But if you can find people who are good at what they do and fun to work with, that makes not only the work you're going to do better, but it also makes the process of doing that work a lot more fun. And when the work is fun, that's going to make you, that's going to make your longevity in that endeavor much greater. You know, you're going to want to stick with it. So find the people you like who do what you want to do and work with them.
Absolutely. I echo Rohan and Neil's comments. And I also would want to add, take inspiration from whatever you enjoy. I really appreciated Rohan's comment in his presentation that he takes inspiration from film and cooking and nature and observing birds and all kinds of things. And that's absolutely true. And it's so important, not just for your own personal well-being, but it really does enrich your professional skills as well, because if you take inspiration from all kinds of things, I never ever thought that my love of film, and especially Pixar films, would ever have any practical use in my career. But yeah, here I am. So yeah, first of all, it's really important to spend time on things that are not your work, things that are not science. Too often I hear grad students say things like, oh yeah, I used to play this instrument or I used to play this sport, but then I went to grad school. And you know, no, you need to like maintain those hobbies, maintain those interests, especially in grad school, because that's what's going to help you stay sane, especially now during a pandemic, any hobbies that you can maintain right now. And don't hesitate to think about how those things inspire you and how they train you how to think. Being a musician trains you to think a certain way. Being an artist trains you to think a certain way. Being a filmmaker trains you to think a certain way. Being a chef, being a cartoonist, being an illustrator, being a photographer, all of that impacts how you approach anything. And that gives you a unique creative approach combined with any other specific knowledge that you have. So take inspiration from everything, and nothing is a waste of time.
So I just wanted to say thanks so much to the three of you. This has been just fantastic, and we've been getting a lot of feedback. I think people are getting a lot out of this. So really appreciate your time and your expertise. This has been wonderful. And Lucia, thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate that, and for the ATBC.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Jennifer's words. It's been just wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil, Rohan, and Sarah, for such really inspiring talks. And I think we all learned a lot out of this. Thank you so much also, Jennifer, for joining and helping to organize this whole session. This has really been a lot of fun, and I'm reading such wonderful comments here. I wanted to actually read out loud one here that says, "Thank you all for the great talks and insights. It's been really important and in a way calming to the nerves to hear about the path you've all taken to get where you are now, from someone who's in a kind of a professional crossroads now." So I think this really sums up a lot of the general feeling that this webinar has inspired. And well, before we close, I just would like to remind everyone of our upcoming webinars. So let me share my screen for a second here. So on September 16th, we have a webinar on teaching tropical biology and conservation. And in October, we will have a 3-part webinar on frontiers in tropical biology and conservation, which will talk about structure and function of tropical ecosystems, biotic interactions in tropical ecosystems, and climate change, history, environment, and society. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone once more. Thank you so much, all of our attendees, for joining us today. And I hope you all enjoyed these really awesome talks and discussions, and that this session, I hope, has inspired all of you to share your science more broadly, as well as has shown you some paths forward on how to do this. So thank you so much once more. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again next month in our next webinars. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. And to the person who shared that last comment about being at a professional crossroads, I hear you, I feel you, having been there myself, and I'm so glad that you found this webinar helpful today. I wish I had a webinar like this to watch 5 years ago when I started doing this work. So I'm really, really glad that you found it inspiring and helpful. And again, thank you, Lucia and Jennifer, so much for the invitation to be part of this. Thank you, Rohan and Neil. It's been such a pleasure to work with all of you, and I'm really excited to learn about your work. And thank you, everybody, for watching today. And please, again, feel free to reach out to any of us. And I'm already looking forward to watching the recording of this webinar so I can see Neil and Rohan's talks again. And thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and be safe.
Likewise, Sarah. Actually, for a person like me who's actually been using the visual medium, but not really analytically and not really analyzing the impact of his work, I got to learn a lot from both of your talks about how to look back and maybe better my work and take it forward. So thanks a lot for being so open and frank in both your presentations. And of course, both Jennifer and Lucia, thanks for being such great hosts.
Absolutely.
This was such a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And please look for the recordings of the webinar on the ATBC YouTube channel. They will be available starting on Monday. Thank you.
Terrific.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.